This is Dr. Thomas Klein. I'm coming to you from Raleigh, North Carolina. I got a bunch of papers this morning, and we are recording this within 3 hours because it is significant. We now have irrefutable evidence the CDC has mismanaged and misused their data. They have reported twice as many overdose deaths due to opioids. They have not defined opioids clearly, that they are lumping heroin and opioids with prescription drugs that are opioids, with prescription drugs that are not prescribed. And we've been saying that all along, but we now have a couple of nice papers that really do bring this to a light. We're going to provide the links to these 3 papers on our National Pain Council website within the next several hours. This paper just came out last week. The paper is written by a medical school doctor, J.F. Pepin, P-E-P-I-N, and a journalist, J.J. Coleman, a nice combination. And basically this is called CDC's Efforts to Quantify Prescription Drug Overdose Deaths Falls Short. They start off by saying that the whole mess goes back to a paper, which we'll call number 3, produced by a man named Seth, S-E-T-H, from the CDC. And this paper, you can see, I don't normally highlight this much, but this paper was published 3 years ago, 2018, in an obscure journal, and when it first came out, nobody could get copies without paying $35. The authors are put at the end, which is a little unusual. All 4 authors are from the CDC. This is actually a CDC paper, but they don't say so because it's not published on the CDC website where everything else is published. You know, more obfuscation. So what this paper said was, we've screwed up in collecting our data. That there were not 35,000 prescription opioid involved deaths, remember, are involved. So if you die from an alcohol overdose and you got a prescription for oxycodone, it's a opioid-related death. So what it boils down to is in 2016, the number of deaths was 32,000, and in fact, it was only 17,000. Now, it's still too many people to die, but who's dying? It's not said, but it started to say so here in this paper in 2018 by Seth, that it looks like the number of people with prescribed prescription drugs who die is in a very tiny minority. That's what we've been saying all along, that people who die, even though CDC didn't own up to it, are people with heroin disease. So this was a big mea culpa. They were misclassifying the drugs. They put all the drugs into these numbers, T41, and then they don't talk to people. What this is, the CDC basically came up with all their conclusions based on numbers without doing any human research. That's pretty disgusting. So this sat around for 3 years until Pippin and Coleman last week published this paper in Pain and Therapeutics. Now, what they did is they start off by saying the paper by Seth in 1918 acknowledged for the first time the number of deaths reported by the CDC was erroneous. Now, the CDC reports these huge numbers, and where did it go? Went to the White House. And when it went to the White House, they said, oh my God, we have a horrible epidemic. We got to track down doctors. We got to get the CDC to, see if we can stop prescribing, get rid of these opioids based on the wrong information. And as we pointed out many times, on the wrong supposition. So CDC gets all its information through death certificates sent in from the states. Death certificates are anywhere from 50 to 30% wrong. So the CDC is basing its assumptions on data that's 30 to 50% inaccurate. There's an old thing in computers, garbage in, garbage out. If you don't put in reliable data, you're not going to get reliable data that comes out the other end. The difficulties are outlined in this paper for people to want to read. It has to do with coding. Methadone deaths were wrongly coded. Benzodiazepine deaths were wrongly coded. The authors conclude the CDC was at fault for failing to recognize and correct the problem before 2016. So in other words, they knew, in our paper here by Seth, one of their own, they knew it was wrong and they did not correct it. Now, if a federal government agency is putting out dangerous information, dangerous medical information they shouldn't have been putting out in the first place, and it's causing the destruction and ruination of several million lives and people who kill themselves because they're cut off, it's up to them to fix the problem. Actually, Congress told them to fix the problem in 2018, but they haven't. So if you know that something is wrong, causing harm, and you do nothing about it, that is negligence. And I talked to a lawyer friend of mine, and you brought up the word criminal negligence. In other words, if you cause the death of somebody and you know that it's related and you do nothing about it, yeah, whether or not that's true, at least it popped up in conversation. The authors made a very nice summary on page 2. And you can get all of these documents online. There are free copies for all of them. And I'll just go over them. And we're going to do this in 2 parts because this is a big deal. And I want to not gloss over it. The key summary is the CDC erroneously reported prescription opioid overdose deaths in 2016 and 10 years before. The error was traced to miscoding meant by coding in fentanyl that was they didn't collect the data correctly for street fentanyl and medication fentanyl. Systemic errors began with error-prone death certificate information that we just mentioned. Besides the fentanyl error, other limitations were in error, including benzodiazepines, cocaine, and methadone. Those were all wrong. So they're feeding all this wrong information in there to jack the numbers up. And then, according to Seth's paper by the CDC writers, 50% wrong, 100% inflated. 17,000 instead of 32,000. Most methadone today is used for treating opioid addiction, which it's not prescribed. So you see it doesn't fall into the prescription category. CDC was aware of the error back in 2005 to 2007. And we're going to stop there for a minute because 2005 to 2007 is 2006. Okay, we did a video here in January 17th, that you can go find, called CDC 2006. Remember, this was the paper by Leonard Pelosi, an employee of the CDC, who we found out later joined COP, the Physicians for Reduced Opioid Prescriptions, and another fellow by the name of Budnitz. This paper we consider to be the watershed picture. This paper. This is when the government was told by the doctors that it was, and I quote from the Pelosi paper, 2006, since 2002, prescription drugs have recently replaced the illegal drug, heroin, as the most common cause of fatal drug poisoning in the United States. Okay? That's pretty important. And that's a direct quote from this paper. 2 years after this was published, this paper was presented at a Senate subcommittee whose chairman was Joe Biden. So 2 years after this, in 2008, Joe Biden started off believing these people from the CDC that prescription drugs had now overtaken heroin. Don't worry about heroin anymore. These are prescription drugs that are causing the opioid crisis of millions of overdose deaths, and according to Trump, millions of addictions, which there's no data for. So this paper by Pippin and Coleman really emphasized that this got started in 2006. It's been there ever since, and it's based on errors in data. CDC never did a study where they went out and talked to people, interviewed people. We interviewed people and we said, do you think your medicine's working? And 85% said yes, these were long-term patients. But the CDC decided they wanted to practice medicine with numbers, and we don't think that is proper. So I'm going to take a little break, and we're going to start with part 2.